And please do contribute your questions. They're very helpful. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations and issues and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will discuss improving the health of rivers, lakes, and oceans that comprise America's waterways with guests. Marissa Christiansen, President and CEO of Friends of the LA River. Joe Brammeier, CEO of the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And Cindy Zipf, Executive Director of Clean Ocean Action. A reminder to Zoom attendees that we'll take 3 snap polls during the show and we'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all for joining us. It's just wonderful to have you. It's such an important topic, and we're all experiencing now some of the downstream effects of some of our previous behaviors, downstream effects being the operative word here. So as we talk about this, let's flow with the waters from the rivers to the lakes and to the oceans. And we'll start with you, Marissa. Marissa, could you talk about some of the challenges you face today as you try to get people involved in improving the state of the LA River?
Yeah, and Mark, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for that message on COVID and the importance of wearing masks. It's great to hear people pushing that. The challenges of the Los Angeles River. Well, I think the first challenge is a lot of people don't know that there's a river in Los Angeles. It's seen as a flood control channel, even after 35 years of advocating for it to be returned to its natural state. But you mentioned the effects of, or the downstream effects of our previous behavior. And I think the ultimate downstream effect is climate change. And one of the challenges we have in LA is it's such an urban environment that's been built up around the river that it is very constrained in concrete and is not performing like a river. But of course, with this 51-mile body of water that's connected to the ocean, we have this immense opportunity to do some meaningful in-channel habitat restoration, cleaning some of the lands that are alongside the river that have long been contaminated, and covering the river with a tree canopy so that you start to get the kind of benefits like carbon sequestration, clean air production, urban shade and cooling as opposed to the extreme heat that we're facing, and biodiversity. And so the big challenge that I'm interested in taking on now is really educating people about that opportunity and the crucial importance of it in this moment in time.
It's so interesting because you're connecting global warming to the acts that are taken on a micro level within a city, even a city as large as Los Angeles. And there are also interests that impinge on the shape of a river, like flood control, right? So as we look at this, and let's move over to the Great Lakes now, Joel. As we look at this, you have the same kind of issues with the Great Lakes, but you also have other issues with adjoining agricultural lands and agricultural runoff. You have in the Great Lakes a huge recreational component in industry. You actually have a commercial element because people are using the Great Lakes to transship goods and products through the United States. How do you see the problem? How would you frame the problem for the Great Lakes?
Well, I think you started to put your finger on it there, Mark, in that this is a huge Great Lakes water system that serves more than 40 million people as their source of drinking water, and it's a commercial system, and it's a recreational economy, right? And so there's a lot of demands on all that water. So even though we've got a great deal of fresh water right here in our backyard, there's a lot of pressure on it to serve different needs. I think one of the biggest challenges, actually, and I think we are turning the corner on this in the Great Lakes, is getting people who live here to take a more comprehensive view of what it means to restore and protect fresh water, right? And so there's been a lot of great progress in the Great Lakes in terms of cleaning up old contaminated sites over the last several decades, stopping invasive species. We've made a lot of progress on that. the problems that are remaining are really complex and interconnected. They're systemic. So things like you mentioned, agriculture pollution is a huge problem in the Great Lakes region. And this also happens to be part of the nation's and the world's breadbasket. And so solving the problem of polluted runoff at the scale over millions and millions of acres that we're trying to do in the Great Lakes, that's a big challenge. Similarly, we've got major challenges with delivering safe and clean and affordable drinking water to people. Half the reason that people are passionate about the Great Lakes is because it's our drinking water. And so again, that's a very systemic, complex problem that kind of literally runs through the infrastructure of all of our Great Lakes cities and towns. I'm excited because I do think, especially with COVID and this realization that health and water are really deeply connected, people are starting to realize that protecting the Great Lakes requires actions from all corners, and it's an exciting time to be doing this work.
And Cindy, as we look at Joel and Marissa's commentary, right? You have the urbanized issue with rivers, right? You have now with Joel, we're talking about drinking water, fresh water. We're talking about all these different uses. The oceans basically take Joel's point and increase it because it's connected to everything. It's connected to our rain. It's connected to the Gulf Stream, is connected to the temperature that we feel, and we've heard that the Gulf Stream may be shifting. It's connected to how we live on this planet. How do you see the problem as your organization tries to address it?
Right. Well, thank you, Mark, so much for having me on the show. And it's great to be going with the flow with Marissa and Joel, because, as they were describing the watersheds that they work on, they all ultimately wind up in the ocean. And there's really just one ocean. We call it different names, but it's really just all interconnected. And it really does connect the world. And with all of the problems that we've just talked about, the common theme is people, right? We seem to be a species that seems to have this kind of crazy approach where we are just doing things to our own demise. And, it's the powerful people like Joel and Marissa that are trying to raise the voices. And I think we are at a turning point. The environment is getting a lot more attention. But the chemicals, the fossil fuels that we've used all over the years, all of those impacts that we're affecting on land all drain into the ocean. And the ocean gets, it gets a lot of attention because it's so big and vast. People really don't understand the role it plays. And Mark, you had identified some of those key things. It controls our temperature. It controls, the weather. It controls, really life on Earth. And especially with 70% of the oxygen we breathe coming from the ocean, it just really we don't really recognize the value of any of our natural habitats. And that's the biggest challenge that we have. I think about us spending billions and billions, and the billionaires spending billions to go up into space to look at a rock, basically, when we have so much life and so much, a marvel of life here on Earth. And we need to be investing more to undo the wrongs that we've done. And they are substantial, as Marissa and Joel have been talking about.
So let's talk a little bit about human behavior, because really the issue that we have right now is that we are using these resources every day. They're part of our lives. We're drinking those resources in the water that we drink. We're crossing rivers through roads. We live adjacent to oceans. We eat of the abundance of these resources. Do we have to really create subtle changes in how we function on a day-to-day basis throughout all of our lives, whether we are farming or whether we are walking on a concrete pavement? Is that really where we're at here, Joel, in order to get the change that we need?
I think, Mark, maybe the flip side of that question too is, can we all do it individually, or do we need some more dramatic change from, that we all support? And I think that, taking the example of agriculture for a moment, because it's a big part of one of the Great Lakes, clean water challenges. We grow a lot of row crops in the Great Lakes. We create a lot of dairy products and meat products. And I'm a practical person, and I don't expect that is going to change or completely transform overnight. And I also know what gives me confidence is that you can do that differently. You can actually create those food products, and you can, and then part of it is also the creation of ethanol, frankly, but you can actually do some of that in different ways that make the land healthier, that actually have a carbon benefit for the world, and create clean water as a result of farming practices, rather than just allowing what's considered waste chemicals to run off into our rivers and eventually create these huge toxic algae blooms in the Great Lakes. So those kinds of systemic changes, I have confidence that we can actually live with them, and that we can actually, as you said, make individuals can have sort of feel that subtle change or that subtle impact, because I know that some of those are actually profitable and sustainable for the long term. And you could replicate that conversation in any other area, like, for example, microplastic pollution, or the investment in the water infrastructure for our cities and towns. The individual impact, the individual cost is relatively minor, but we do all have to be together and speaking with one voice to get the scale of investment and the scale of change that we actually need.
Now, Marissa, Joel also referred to the possibility of dramatic projects, and there's no more dramatic city or project, no more dramatic city than LA, and no more dramatic project than a massive transformation of the LA River. Are you suggesting that really what needs to be done is we take a jackhammer to these concrete waterways and clear neighborhoods so that the river can spread and take its natural course? How are you seeing this?
So definitely not, right? We have to do this, much like Joel said, we do have to restore the river within the context that it now is. And we would never advocate for displacement at all. But the big missing link here is that we haven't actually had a watershed-wide comprehensive plan that looks at opportunities off of the river for stormwater detention, for permeability, things that actually prevent stormwater from getting to the river in the first place, because that's the problem, right? The river can only hold so much in a massive storm, and we're expecting even bigger, more frequent storms.
So just to catch everyone up, and we find this in Houston as well, when you concrete over wetlands and natural runoff areas, right? And what ends up is that you have fewer and fewer mechanisms for runoff, and then you end up with floods, right? So when there are rains periodically, and we see this a lot in Houston, we see it in LA. You instead of a river, you end up with just a viaduct to get rid of the storm waters, and it's just it's not an approach that is working. It's not working in these different urban areas. That's what you're basically saying. So we have to have a more holistic approach.
Right, and what we do know, because we've done sort of a snapshot of a piece of the watershed at sort of the headwaters of the river. And even just looking at that, we have found hydrologically that there are opportunities for detention, for permeability throughout the watershed, such that you can start to remove concrete in certain areas, and not just without compromising flood control, but actually improving flood control. And that's the misinformation that's out there, specifically in LA. The misinformation is that flood control is contrary to ecological restoration, and we know scientifically that is not the case.
It's really interesting. We just finished a first poll, and we asked in that poll, how do you protect our waterways? And then we gave a number of different answers. Now, here's the thing that really surprised me. is that more than half of the people said that I don't understand the best way to protect our waterways. The balance said about 40% said nothing prevents me from protecting the waterways, but that we had over half of the respondents said, I just don't know what to do. It really talks the scale of this problem, doesn't it, Cindy? I mean, we can just take a little bit of action, I guess, by not allowing leaky faucets to disperse our clean water. But this question mark. So could you answer the question? What can I do today? What can I do today?
Did you direct that to me? I'm sorry, Mark. Yeah. So that is the great question. That's the thing that we all strive for in our organizations. I'm sure Joel and Marissa have lots of educational programs and opportunities to educate people. Education is the key to this entire problem. It's being aware of what you're doing and making the conscious decision to help. I think, the fact that so many people now have gotten the message on the plastic bags, right? It's kind of bring your own bag and bring your own reusable water bottle. And we're beginning to make the connection to individual people that their behavior matters. And so everything you do is connected to the environment. All the waste you generate, what you throw down, what you put down the toilet, and all of those things, all of this that goes down your sink, it's all connected. So it's just really becoming what we call waterway mindful, creating a mindfulness about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis that contributes to pollution, whether you're using fertilizers, whether or not you're using pesticides and herbicides on your properties. All these things, when it rains, wash off and go into the nearest body of water and then ultimately to the ocean. So that's really where the hope is that there are so many things that people can do. But the key is for them to reflect in a mindful way what they are doing on that day-to-day basis.
So your admonition is to take inventory of our lives and our behaviors, right? I mean, if we're buying a product and it's a product in a shell contained within a box, wrapped in plastic, which is delivered in a carton on a pallet in a truck that is shipped from 4 different points to a manufacturer, where the ingredients are shipped from 4 different points to a manufacturing facility, which manufactures it and puts the product in a little plastic cup and puts a piece of foil over it, and there's paint on the foil, right? All of that to get our little yogurt in this little thing, right? This little thing. All of that is, you're saying we should really think about that.
We should think about it. And as Joel said, we have to be, sort of realistic about it, but raising the questions and really asking and taking responsibility to do something about it. There's more and more opportunities, and it's our world, because we're, we live in a society where, it's supply and demand, right? So if we as a people start demanding things to be presented in a more environmentally sensible, sustainable way, that's when things will really start to change.
So Joel, we just completed another poll, and we asked about the health of the waterways. We gave a lot of different options. All are healthy. Rivers are healthier, lakes are healthier, oceans are healthier comparatively than the others. And 100% of the people said all are unhealthy. So there's a huge awareness that we have an issue. Let's continue on this. So we talked about consumerism. Let's talk about recreation a bit, because there's so much recreation that goes on in the Great Lakes. If I'm a recreational boater, if I'm a fisher, if I'm someone who fishes, if I'm somebody else who uses the Great Lakes for windsurfing, how do I get involved? How do I change my behaviors? How do I become an advocate for the treasure that is the Great Lakes?
Absolutely. And the great thing about these beautiful bodies of water that we all work on is that they generate constituencies. People see them and enjoy them and want to do more to protect them. And we see that throughout the Great Lakes region. So in addition to Cindy's points about individual behaviors and being mindful, which I think are great, I also tell people no matter where you are, if you see that water and you use it and you have a passion for it, I can guarantee you there's a local organization that is working to shift policies and practices in that community to better protect those places. And so I always encourage people to look for getting involved in an organization like that, whether it's as a volunteer or as a donor. It's just like there are groups doing this work, and there are leaders doing this work that are sort of embedded in communities. And I also encourage people not to be cynical or skeptical about larger scale policy change. I know there's a lot of antipathy for politics right now, and a feeling that perhaps especially if you're not on the fringe, there might be some apathy about feeling like maybe my voice doesn't make a difference. That's absolutely not true. I encourage people to reach out to their elected officials, reach out to their decision makers, because when they hear from you directly and you live in their district, they actually really do pay attention. I've been doing this work for a long time, and I just want to continue to remind people not to get cynical or skeptical about decisions that affect their lives, because they really do make a difference to the issues we all work on.
There's an awful lot of question of voice here as well, particularly in urban environments. If you take a look at a city like Chicago, an urban environment where you have different interest groups and different perspectives. There are issues of race and justice. The fact that people of color are not necessarily have not necessarily been their concerns integrated into the environmental movement in the way that they should be. You see that reflected on boards and staffs. We were talking about that a little bit before the show. Marissa and Joel in particular, could you comment on how you are trying to ensure that in your programs you are addressing those kinds of issues and trying to change the constellation of support and outreach that you're engaging in order to change the structure of support and staffing that you have? Marissa, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, and I have to warn you, I have 2 toddlers screaming in the background.
Oh, that's okay. We all have kids, so
yeah. It's their way of saying good morning. It's a really important issue that you're bringing up, Mark, particularly in a highly urbanized city like Los Angeles. Our river is 51 miles, and because it's been wrapped in concrete and considered just a piece of linear gray infrastructure, it does wind through the most marginalized communities in LA. So it goes through some of the most densely populated, some of the most underserved. And so truly the work that we do impacts those communities the most, and yet those communities haven't really been at the table, and we recognize that.
Haven't been asked. They haven't been asked, and yeah. They haven't been listened to. And
that's right.
How do we change that? How do we? I mean, you can't just flip a switch and gain credibility with people who've been ignored.
That's right. Well, I think no one has all the answers, right? This is complicated work. And I think the answers are nuanced, but it starts with listening to those folks, not asking them to do something for you, but listening to what's important to them. It starts with folks like us who do have a consistent seat at the table, pushing for others to have the seat at the table as well. It's really up to us, the ones who have had the power and the privilege to have these roles, to push for change. And that starts at every single level. It starts at who you're talking to, in the public, who you're engaging with, what your team looks like, what your board looks like, both racially, but also gender and skill set wise. And so those are the changes that we are working on now.
It's really about mutuality, isn't it, Joel?
Well, I have to echo +10 to what Marissa just said about listening and being responsive to what you hear. and not assuming that what you're currently doing is necessarily addressing the highest expressed need. I also want to mention, as I was talking about before the session today, Mark, we're just wrapping up creation of our next strategic plan, and I'm really thankful that one of my board members said during that process, what would it have looked like if 4 or 5 decades ago the traditional conservation movement and the environmental justice movement in the Great Lakes had not actually diverged into 2 separate movements? There is a thriving environmental justice movement in the Great Lakes region that's been largely separate from the traditional conservation world for a long time. And a lot of that is because people did not see the issues that were important to them expressed in the traditional conservation movement, and sometimes were actively excluded from that movement. And so we're reckoning with that and trying, for our part, trying to figure out what it means where we can play a real role in bridging that gap and trying to address the fact that we have work to do to work on issues that are more relevant to more of the people who live across this region. And that's something that's really important to us. And finding a way to exercise who we are as a traditional organization and be part of that really critical effort is just fundamentally important to the Alliance. And I noted that we're all, Marissa, Cindy, and I just happen to represent the 3 largest cities in the United States. In our own small ways, but I thought that was critical to this conversation too.
It is. Cindy, I'm going to give you the last word since we're coming to the end of our time. I do want to note that when we ask the question about engaging the public, there seems to be a huge consensus that radio, print, and online advertising is a great way to reach people. But there are also some views that a more dispersed approach and a more holistic approach that includes education, use of events and recreation, lobbying, advocacy, and so on and so forth, that all of those means are also extremely important. So a very holistic approach. But Cindy, I'd like to give you sort of a last word. It seems to me that we have, over the last couple hundred years, particularly during the industrial age in the world, that we've put the oceans and the waterways of the world into kind of a little bucket that is sort of another extractive resource from which we can extract. And I think we're at this point where we have to give back and we have to involve everybody in that process. If you look at the attitudes of the traditional attitudes of Native peoples around the world toward their waters, it was filled with reverence. We removed that reverence and created simply a transactional relationship. How do we change the way we work going into the future, where reverence becomes part of what we're doing, and that reverence is transformed into concern for conservation and sustainability?
That's a beautiful question. And it really boils down to education, and even preschool on up. It really does require us to sort of change the mindset to have more respect for the natural world, and have the reverence and the sacredness of the life-giving force that this natural world provides us, particularly water. I mean, I think you're seeing around the world, when water runs dry, it becomes more important than gold. But that's kind of at the too late stage, right? We need to start creating that reverence early on and across all community groups and all levels, because, it is a common ground. It is something that we all need, no matter what our income is, we all need clean water to survive. And if I could just say, it's not about just us, we the people, right? There's a lot of species on the planet that also depend on clean water that allow us to thrive. So that biodiversity is also essential. And I think including in that education is not just allowing the natural world to thrive for us, for we the people, but for all of life on Earth.
And it starts with us being conscious all the moments of our lives when we rise up, when we lie down, and when we throw something in the trash can. What are we doing that might affect our world? Marissa Christiansen, President CEO of Friends of the LA River, Joel Brammeier, CEO of the Alliance for the Great Lakes, Cindy Zipf, Executive Director of Clean Ocean Action. Thank you so much for sharing the wisdom that you've accumulated in your careers with us today. Thank your staff, thank your donors, thank your boards for the great work that you're doing. Participants and attendees, thank you so much for coming in and being part of this show. And everybody stay safe, mask up.
Mask up.